We'll be discussing the ideology and construction of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, particularly in the countries of Iraq and Syria. So why is this a topic of interest? Well, today there's a lot of confusion related to the politics of the Middle East, which the Arab world is a major part of. The topic of Syria and Iraq are often discussed with little to no knowledge of the modern history by both the corporate establishment media and, unfortunately, even many people who are anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist. There are many myths about the leadership and policy of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party. So I'm going to start with a quote. Social classes are to be abolished, as is anachronistic nomadism. This quote is from the Constitution of the Ba'ath Party at its first Congress held in Damascus in Syria in 1947, with Michel Aflaq, one of the founders of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, and Arsuzi, another founder of the Ba'ath Party, present. Now, this is a very significant quote because this is the foundation of the Ba'ath Party and the Ba'ath movement. There's a lot more that a lot of people know about, such as the concept of pan-Arabism, which is truly the key aspect of Baathism. And of course, the term Ba'ath is an Arabic word which means renaissance or rebirth. This quote, I think, emphasizes that not only was the Ba'ath Party, the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, a nationalist party, it was a very truly socialist party in their beliefs from the very foundation. And another reason why this is such an important quote is because, as I'll go through the complicated history, sometimes it's a little confusing to keep track of the different factions and the different sections of the party, because there have been significant disagreements within the party over its years. But this is something from the first Congress of the party that all of the factions come out of. This statement would have to apply to the goals of all of the Baathist movements coming forward, which I'll cover. So as I stated, the Ba'ath Party was founded in Damascus, Syria, in 1947. And the ideology of the Ba'ath Party, it's a socialist, Arab socialist, pan-Arabist party. Pan-Arabism is the idea that the Arab world, the Arabic-speaking world, is one nation which had been divided by imperialism and colonialism, and that famously Sykes-Picot, which drew the arbitrary borders between Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and other places in the Middle East, that these borders would need to be abolished and the Arab world united into one state, from Morocco all the way across to Iraq, one Arab nation. As well as the name, as the slogan of the Ba'ath Party is unity, freedom, socialism, putting great emphasis on, as I previously mentioned, unity within the Arab world. Secondly, freedom, the idea of democracy, and the idea that in a socialist society there needs to be a level of freedom and national democratic rights for the people, and multi-party system, actually, which is, a lot of people don't know, the Ba'ath Party does believe in Iraq and Syria and other places where it's operated, that the system needs to be a multi-party system, in fact. And in both Baathist Iraq and Baathist Syria, despite them being attacked so often as dictatorships, single-party dictatorships, both countries actually had multiple parties in the government. In Iraq, through the National Assembly and the cabinet, the Communist Party and Kurdish political parties had positions in the government, along with the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party. And in Syria, in the People's Council and the cabinet, the Communist Party and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, as well as other parties, share power with the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party in Syria. So there's also some confusion. Some people may think, well, especially with a quote like this, that social classes are to be abolished. How is this different from, say, communism or Marxism, Marxism-Leninism? Also, another question that may arise is, how is this different from other forms of Arab nationalism and Arab socialism? Because there are multiple forms besides Baathism. A very notable form is Nasserism. Now, first, dealing with the relation to Marxism, Leninism, or communism, Michel Aflaq and the other founders of the Ba'ath Party were sort of turned away from being communists in name, actual, Communist Party members, because the local communist parties in the Arab world in Syria had taken a very incorrect position of supporting colonialism, which seems to be, a total contradiction of the ideas that they should, would be standing for, that Lenin talked about, with imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, and so on. And actually, Michel Aflaq was a communist activist in his early days, but once the Communist Party took that, terrible position, he felt that there needed to be a new party, a new movement within the Arab world to achieve the national liberation of the Arab world and socialism. Another thing that the Baathists talk about is that rather than drawing, they recognize the writings of Marx and Engels as, very progressive writings, that for Arab socialism to be successful, it needs to be rooted in the culture of the Arab world. And Michel Aflaq, interestingly, one of the key founders of the Ba'ath Party, was a Christian, but his view on the concept of Arabism was that Christianity, or Arabism, even Christian Arabs and Arab Jews, and basically even non-Muslim Arabs, their identity is very much shaped by Islam, and that Islam does play a very important role in, need to play a very important role in developing socialism, Arab socialism. As relates to Nasserism, I'm sure many people have heard of the United Arab Republic, and Nasser, who's the president of Egypt. He overthrew a corrupt pro-Western monarchy, and he was a very progressive leader. He considered himself to be a socialist. His party was the Arab Socialist Union. He had very similar, him and Nasserism and Baathism both believe in pan-Arabism and Arab socialism. But the Arab socialism, as I'll get into, there's somewhat different viewpoint. Many people have probably heard about the United Arab Republic, which existed in the 1950s. It eventually fell apart because there were a number of issues such as corruption and even though the pan-Arabists in Syria really wanted to unite Syria and Egypt, the way it was done the first time was in a way that really, it really rubbed a lot of the Syrians the wrong way. It sort of put Syria in a subservient position. So there was a lot of discontent with the United Arab Republic, despite the fact that, the goal was, the Baathists in Syria and other pan-Arabists in Syria wanted that sort of thing to push Arab unity further. During that time, there was extensive communications and debates. During the time of the United Arab Republic, there was extensive communication and debate with the Baathists and Nasser. And there's some interesting conversations with, as it relates to the type of socialism that existed. There's a conversation between Michel Aflaq, one of the founders of the Ba'ath Party, and Nasser, where Aflaq is saying that this form of what you call socialism, it doesn't have, being that, when the United Arab Republic was formed, one of the preconditions is that all parties besides the Arab Socialist Union, Nasser's party, would need to be banned, including the Ba'ath Party. And the Baathists initially went along with that, but over time, they saw that there were broader problems, and they pulled back from that. And Aflaq, in his conversation with Nasser, he's talking about how for there to be socialism, there really needs to be national democracy. You need to have multi-parties. You need to have discussion and debate. You can't just have a one-party state. And that's part of the reason why the first United Arab Republic ended up falling apart, and it ended up failing because it was too bureaucratic and didn't really take into account the socialist and nationalist parties that had existed within Syria already. So you're starting to see it is the scene of Pan-Arabism, Arab socialism. It's kind of complex. There's different factors. To make it even more complex, within the Ba'ath Party itself, the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, there began to be factions within the party. The next important date to deal with is 1963, first in Iraq. Now, this is a very important date because tremendous amount of myths about Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi Baathists are related to this date, 1963, in February, in Iraq. What was called the Ramadan Revolution took place. The Ramadan Revolution overthrew a military government of Abdul Karim Qasim, who was a military strongman of Iraq who had come to power in 1958, riding the wave of popular outrage and progressive movement in Iraq. He didn't belong to a party. He was a military man, sort of a military bureaucrat. And the revolution of 1958 that brought him to power was led by the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, the Communist Party in Iraq, and the Nasserists, particularly those three. Qasim's regime, while they made some progressive reforms, the feeling with the Nasserists and Baathists and even the Communist Party was that Qasim was really moving too slowly and was not really developing the country in a socialist direction, and was sort of preserving a bureaucracy that was stifling the country. And one of the problems that these parties had with Qasim particularly was that when these parties would try to push the government to be more progressive, anti-imperialist, nationalist, he would repress the parties. So the three main revolutionary parties in Iraq, the Communist Party, the Ba'ath Party, and the Nasserists, the Arab Socialist Union in Iraq, they tried to work together to try and pressure Qasim to make better policies. But at a certain point, and this sort of reminds us of the previous bad policies of the local communist parties, unfortunately, the Communist Party in Iraq felt that they were the revolutionary force, and that any type of nationalist socialism was quote-unquote bourgeois nationalism, which is quite ironic when, you know, the founding of the Ba'ath Party talks about that social classes are to be abolished. I don't know how anyone can identify that as bourgeois nationalism. So the Iraqi Communist Party, over time, despite the Qasim regime's opportunistic activities and reactionary activities holding back the progress of Iraq and actively opposing Pan-Arabism, the Iraqi Communist Party sees Qasim as a potential ally to beat the Baathists and Nasserists in Iraq, and they sort of attach themselves to the Qasim regime. They don't have much influence over Qasim, but they sort of attack the Baathists and Nasserists, try to delegitimize what they stand for. It's ironic because Qasim, at certain times when the Communist Party would get too powerful, he actually repressed the Communist Party even. So it kind of just shows the level of opportunism that they had at that point. Even though Qasim targeted them when they were getting more power, they still united with him against the other progressive anti-imperialist forces. So, as I stated in the beginning of this section, 1963, it was the Ramadan Revolution in February 1963, which overthrew the Qasim regime, and that was led by the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party in Iraq. and the Nasrists, the Arab Socialist Union. Now, there was a long hostility, as I mentioned, between the Baathists and Nasrists on one side and the Communist Party of Iraq and the Qasem regime on the other side. And the Communist Party actually took up arms in counter-revolution to oppose the Ramadan revolution of the Nasrists and the Baathists. And this is where a tremendous myth about the Ba'ath Party and Saddam comes from. Before getting into the myth, so the Communist Party takes up arms. There's a very brief almost a civil war within Baghdad, capital of Iraq. Very brief, but there's fighting in the streets between the Nasrists, Baathists on one side, and the Communist Party and the Qasem government. Qasem is captured and executed, put on national TV, and the Communists continue their armed opposition to the Ba'ath Party. And things actually get quite ugly between the Baathists and Nasrists and the Communists. There's a tremendous amount of bloodshed on the part of the Communist Party. A lot of communists are killed at this point. A lot of propaganda against Saddam and the Ba'ath Party comes from this fact. But the fact is, when someone is taking up arms in counter-revolution against the revolution, do you expect the Baathists and Nasrists just to sit back and allow themselves to be killed in their revolution and the progress of the country to be held back, even if these people call themselves communists? I mean, we've seen that, in our world, there are parties that have called themselves communists who have sided with imperialism and also with Zionism. The Arab communist parties actually, very mistakenly and very foolishly, following the Comintern line, recognize the State of Israel. The counter-revolution led by the Qasem regime and the Communist Party is quickly put down. And the Baathists and Nasrists take power. And the amazing thing is that despite this really bad, hostility, one of the top leader of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq at the time, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, who he has a joint leathleadership with the Nasrists and a general or a leader named Arif, who later becomes the Arif regime. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, before the international media who are there in Baghdad, he says that despite the fighting with the Communist Party before the international cameras and everything, he says, we are not anti-communists in any way. We're against anti-communism. The only reason for this is because they took up arms against us and we have no other option. So as you can see, there's some of this may sound somewhat familiar to some of you. There's a lot of myths that the Baathists, quote unquote, slaughter the communists and so on. Well, this is largely where it stems from. And there's a particular myth about this, and related to Saddam Hussein, which is a little strange because he was not a top leader of the Ba'ath Party at this point. He was a young activist, and he was very brave and very active. He'd actually, some years earlier, he had attempted to assassinate Abdul Karim Qasem earlier, and it was an unsuccessful assassination attempt. He had to flee. I think he was 20 or 21 or something when he attempted that. But for some reason, a lot of ostensibly anti-imperialist intellectuals and speakers and stuff claim that the CIA somehow had a role in this revolution, despite the fact that the people carrying it out were Arab nationalists, anti-Zionist, anti-imperialist socialists, scientific socialists, as we'll get to in a little bit, what they believe in Iraq and what they implemented. Why would the CIA be in favor of that? And it's interesting because this claim stemmed from, if you look into this claim, CIA involvement in the Ramadan Revolution in Iraq, 1963, it stems from a very reactionary source who actually was backed by the United States. King Hussein from Jordan actually claimed this following the revolution. And the reason why he said, he was being interviewed by some reporters. You can find this, I think even Wikipedia has this. You look into the Ramadan Revolution, the claims of the CIA, you'll find this and who he was specifically being interviewed by. But he said, basically because he was being criticized by Baathists as being pro-imperialist and pro-Zionist, which he was, and a reactionary monarch, he tried to throw it back at them. King Hussein was basically saying, how dare you say that I'm a reactionary pro-imperialist. You guys were backed by the CIA. Of course, he didn't give any evidence. It was just a wild claim that he threw out there. And if you look into it, the CIA documents, there's no evidence. There's been loads of CIA documents declassified and CIA people coming out talking about their activities all over the world, including in Iraq. But there's no evidence that the CIA played any role in it. Now, some of them probably, with the fighting with the Communist Party, some of them probably welcomed that naively because they felt that, oh, this will weaken the communists. But later they learned that the Arab Socialists were just as much their enemy as the Communist Party, if not more so. And it's interesting because I want to highlight, one particular academic, and he's actually a very smart guy, and he's a very truthful person, and he's actually a great academic, but he's wrong on this. His name's Parenti. I think you've probably heard of him, Parenti. You can find on YouTube a particular video about the United States and Saddam, and he gives this insane claim that the CIA, they worked with Saddam to kill the communists, which is an absolute myth. There's no evidence of it. This is just a lie repeated so many times that it becomes a truth. And unfortunately, people with credibility like him, who, as I said, he is a very good guy and he tells the truth and he does very good work. When people like that say this sort of thing, it's able to, people keep repeating it without actually seeing where it comes from, the origins of it. So the myth of Saddam and the CIA, and the Ba'ath Party and the CIA is discredited, I would say. This 1963, this is when the Ba'ath Party first takes power in Iraq, 1963, and as I said, it's a coalition with the Nasrists. Later in that year, the revolution happened in February 1963. In November of 1963, the Nasrists, led by a person named Arif, actually expelled the Baathists from the government. Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, who was one of the leaders of the country, is pushed out of power. A lot of the Baathists are imprisoned and have to go into hiding. So this is a major setback from the Ba'ath Party, for the Ba'ath Party, and it causes the Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq to reflect and really think about the experience of the 1963 revolution, and what was positive and what was negative and what could be improved in the future. And there is actually a tremendous amount of self-criticism within the Ba'ath Party, saying that despite the Communist Party taking up arms against them and basically trying to stop the revolution, that and Aflaq and others say that it should have been resolved another way, and that it was a terrible thing that there was such a fight between the Communist Party and the Baathists, and that sort of thing should never happen in the future. The Communist Party was very opportunistically supporting a military regime as a wedge against the Baathists and Nasrists. It was the Qasim regime, which they implemented some progressive policies, but the Baathists and Nasrists and even the communists felt that Qasim was not, he was a bureaucratic military man. He didn't really belong to any party. He sort of just rode in on the wave of revolutionary fervor that happened earlier on in the revolution against the monarchy that the Baathists, Nasrists, and communists took part in. And the reason why this was such a problem was because the Qasim government did implement some reforms, such as the agrarian reform, but the Baathists felt that this reform didn't go far enough, and one of the issues that they had with it was that it actually gave full compensation to the landlords for land that was taken from them. And also, this land reform was very ineffective because it actually, the way it was carried out, there was a lot of mismanagement of lands, and most of the land actually never even was redistributed to the peasantry. Later, when the Baathists came in, they made an agrarian reform which didn't give compensation to the landowners, and it was done in an effective way, and the land was actually redistributed to the peasantry, and collective farms and cooperative farms and state farms were implemented. With the Qasim government reform, it was more of a reform on paper rather than an actual real reform. Also, another issue is that the Qasim government had many plans on paper for
industrialization and development of Iraq, but these plans were never really implemented. Some of them were started, but were actually never ended up being completed until the Baathists came to power. On paper, the Qasim government was talking about nationalizing the oil resources, but actually the oil was not nationalized until the Baathists came to power. And the Baathists understood that Iraq couldn't achieve economic independence or socialism unless there was first a level of development carried out by the government, which the Qasim government was not doing.
Qasim was actively targeting and repressing the Nasrists and the Baathists because they were trying to push Qasim to be more pan-Arabist and more socialist. And the Communist Party sided with Qasim as a wedge to try and weaken the Baathists and Nasrists because they wrongly viewed Baathism to be quote-unquote bourgeois nationalism, which I'll get into later why that's a complete falsehood. And what happened was, I don't know if you heard this part, but the Communist Party sided with the Qasim regime against the Baathist and Nasrist revolution, which was occurring in 1963. Also in 1963, a little bit later,
in the following month, in Syria, in March of 1963, the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party carries out a successful revolution against the unpopular, pro-US, pro-British government that came to power after the collapse of the United Arab Republic in 1961. Muhammad Umran, Salah Jadid, Hafiz al-Assad, and other Baathists in the Syrian military are the leaders of this revolution. The goal of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party is to implement socialism and revitalize the push for Arab unity and to drive out the Zionist occupation of Palestine. The newly formed Baathist government faces a formidable opposition by both Nasrist forces remaining in the country and counter-revolutionary forces representing the landed and oligarchic classes, particularly represented by the Muslim Brotherhood, who began their long and violent campaign of terrorism, which is still going on in Syria till this day, who hope to bring back an ultra-conservative social order. The newly established Baathist government acts decisively to eliminate rioting Nasrist forces in numerous cities across Syria and the armed right-wing opposition led by the Muslim Brotherhood. This Baathist government of Syria lasted until 1966, when a faction of military officers overthrew the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party leadership. This coup was carried out by Salah Jadid, Hafiz al-Assad, and a number of other military officers. This coup caused the fracture of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, which continues till this day. The founders of Baathism, Michel Aflaq, Salah ad-Din al-Bitar, Shulbi al-Isami, and other top Baathist leaders were forced to flee Syria following this 1966 coup by Salah Jadid and Hafiz al-Assad. This 1966 coup put Salah Jadid in power as the ruler of Syria.
He's from a military faction within the Ba'ath Party, and this is when we start to see there were divisions previously, but this is where we start to see more of a break within during the Salah Jadid rule in Syria between the military faction of the Ba'ath Party, the civilian faction of the Ba'ath Party, and
so the factional breakdown is often seen as the Saddam Hussein faction and Hafiz al-Assad faction, but what it really is the factions of the military committee, which we see in Syria, with first Salah Jadid and then Hafiz al-Assad, even though later Assad overthrows Salah Jadid, who have Zaki al-Arsuzi on their side. And then we see in Iraq, obviously Saddam Hussein and Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, the political leaders, presidents of Iraq, but also a number of Syrian Baathists, founders of the Baathist ideology, who have to flee Syria because of their differences, such as Michel Aflaq, who is really the key founder of Baathism. Michel Aflaq becomes the General Secretary of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, leading in Iraq, and another well-known member, Shilbi al-Isami, who becomes the Deputy Secretary General of the National Command of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party in Iraq. So you could say that Iraq became led by the original Baathists while Syria became led by what was the military faction of the party, which took over in Syria. As we'll see, the policies implemented in Baathist Iraq and Baathist Syria had some significant differences.
One of the other criticisms of Saleh Jadid was that he was not really pursuing Pan-Arabism. Now, there was the feeling of resentment about the previous United Arab Republic, but the Baathists, a lot of the Baathists, like Mashal Aflaq, believe that even though there was a bad experience with the United Arab Republic, they should try to remake it and learn from those mistakes and make it more of a loose federation between Egypt and Syria and possibly Iraq, being that Pan-Arabists now have control of Iraq. But Saleh Jadid wasn't really pursuing that. They would often, Aflaq would, even though Saleh Jadid was a member of the Ba'ath Party, was a Baathist, the other factions of the Ba'ath Party often criticized Saleh Jadid as being more of a Syrian nationalist. And this is an interesting aspect because even though this veers a little bit out of the direction of Pan-Arabism and Baathism, it's worth touching upon because it's a topic that comes up a lot with when Pan-Arabism is spoken about and Baathism, especially today in Syria, because they do play a role in Syria, and that is the role of the Pan-Syrianists and the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. Now, there's a lot of propaganda against the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. There's a lot of people that claim that it's a Nazi party, a fascist party, but there's a good, if you want to know what the Syrian Social Nationalist Party believes, you should look at what they have to say. You shouldn't look at what Christopher Hitchens has to say or some other, you should look at, go to the source. And this is the problem with a lot of the discussion of politics in the Arab world and a lot of the world, North Korea as well. People don't look at what the actual people of the region have to say. They don't go to the source, like what the leaders had to say. They don't investigate what they actually think. So the Pan-Syrianists, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which is not Baathist, they have a differing view. They believe in Pan-Syrianism, which includes much of the Levant area, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, I believe Jordan, possibly parts of Iraq, and Cyprus, actually. And actually today they're in an alliance with the Syrian government to fight against the imperialist overthrow of the Syrian government. And during the Lebanese civil war, they've actually allied with the Lebanese Communist Party and the Palestinians. So when people say that they're fascists or Nazis, it's a little bit strange. But what makes it even more strange and actually totally disproves and blows it out of the water is a quote by the founder of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, Antun Sadeh. Quote, "I want to use this opportunity to say that the system of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party is neither a Hitlerite nor a fascist one, but a pure social nationalist one." Now this quote from the founder of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party
Is from 1935.
I mean, if there was a time when you were gonna, if you were gonna try and a lot of anti-imperialist forces did think that maybe the Germans and the Nazis would be a force that you could possibly ally with to kick out the British. That was an incorrect position that the Baathists said was wrong. But if there was any time that you would do that for opportunistic reasons, it would be this time. And the founder of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party states clearly that they reject Nazism and fascism and that they have they believe in social nationalism, which is totally different. And as going through their record with their allying with communists and Pan-Arabists and stuff, it's quite clear that they're not Nazis or fascists the way so many of the pro-imperialist left, and honestly even a lot of well-intentioned people may think. I think even at my point I may have had, had some wrong ideas about them, and it's easy to be fooled when you don't look at the actual sources investigating into it yourself. So
in a world in which image is everything, don't you think this logo is a bit harsh? This Syrian nationalist logo is the black flag with this red thing that's kind of...
Yeah, I'm gonna try and get back into, but yeah, related to that, they would say, and I think the Ba'ath Party is much more progressive than the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, but I think you have to look at what they have to say, and they would say that they are not that. And at the point when it would benefit them the most from making an alliance with the Nazis, they denounced them. But what they would say is that symbol is a symbol of secularism because it combines the crescent and the cross. It has nothing to do with the swastika. It's a symbol of secularism, and that it was to unite people of all faiths, all Syrians of all faiths, and to get rid of sex.
In that party, right? It's a very Christian party.
Absolutely, there's a lot of Christians, and I believe the founder, Antun Sadeh, was a Christian. So the reason I brought that up is because 1963, Syria, Salih Jadid, the Baathist leader of Syria at that time, is criticized by other factions of the Ba'ath Party, like Michel Aflaq, as not being pan-Arab enough and being more of a Syrian nationalist. I mean, he was ostensibly not a Syrian nationalist, he was an Arab nationalist. He was a member of the Ba'ath Party, not the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, but it's worth bringing up just so people are aware of the differences between some of the regional players. And today, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party and the Ba'ath Party in Syria are on good terms, and I believe they have positions in government along with the Communist Party of Syria.
Another interesting fact about the Syrian Social Nationalist Party is that they actually signed on to the Pyongyang Declaration, which was held in Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea, on April 20th, 1992, which was a declaration by mostly communist parties from all over the world, including a number of communist parties from the United States, that these parties still hold that socialism, not capitalism, is the future of humanity, despite the setback of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that these parties signing on, which includes the SSNP, would continue to fight for socialism.
There's a lot of discontent within the Ba'ath Party. There's a lot of Baathists that strongly disagree with Salih Jadid, and eventually he is overthrown in 1970 by a name that people probably know much better than the previous names I mentioned. The name of the person who comes to power in Syria is Hafez al-Assad. And Hafez al-Assad is from the military, what's called the military committee of the Ba'ath Party. And there are some significant changes to the Syrian economy and international orientation when Hafez al-Assad comes to power. As I sort of talked about briefly, the class makeup of Syria is quite complex, and coming at it from a viewpoint of socialism and a working class state, which the Ba'ath Party believes in. The situation in Syria is quite complicated, the class relations, and it's a little bit hard to figure the path towards developing the country and actually achieving socialism. The standard view of the working class and the bourgeoisie and the peasantry in Syria is actually very complex, and it's actually quite hard to distinguish between the middle class, the working class, and the peasantry. There's a very small working class in Syria at this time. The way that most Syrians tended to operate at this time was that they would actually be part of multiple classes throughout the year, which may sound very surprising. What I mean by this is that during part of the year, people would often be in the countryside taking part in agriculture. And then during another part of the year, they may come to the cities and sell their agriculture or products, small merchants. And other parts of the year, they may work for someone else, more like a working class situation where they're working for a wage for someone else. So it's quite complex, and Hafez al-Assad believes that the situation in Syria, there has to be economic development, a level of economic development before he could go forward with really strong nationalization of the economy. And a lot of more socialists, like strong socialists and communists, may take issue with what Hafez al-Assad did. There was a somewhat of a liberalization of the economy. There wasn't the state still controlled a tremendous amount of the economy, but there was somewhat of a, you could call it, quote unquote, liberalization of the economy when Hafez al-Assad came in. But before you get too upset by that, I like to read a quote from Lenin. This is around the time of when the Soviet Union actually implemented the new economic policy, when they actually brought in aspects of capitalism to the Soviet Union. Because the country had been so backwards before the revolution, they needed to sort of develop somewhat of a level of capitalism and industrialization before they could nationalize and really start building up the country, to bring investment and so on into the country. So the quote from Lenin is, "Reality tells us that state capitalism will be a step forward. If in a small space of time we could achieve state capitalism, that would be a victory." And I think that quote says a lot to the situation in Syria with Hafez al-Assad.
However, Mashallah Aflaq, who's the leader of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, which is in power in Iraq, would argue that the leadership in Syria, Hafez al-Assad and the military committee, were not true to the original principles of Baathism, and that they were not implementing socialism or the other aspects of the slogan of the Ba'ath Party, unity, freedom, and socialism. They weren't implementing socialism, and that this is a reflection of the fact that Hafez al-Assad and the Ba'ath Party in Syria were not true Baathists, and that the government of Iraq was the only true Baathist government.
And in many ways, what they did implement, you could say, was state capitalist, but for the goal of something greater. Because again, Hafez al-Assad, he is a member of the Ba'ath Party. He does have a view of achieving socialism. But a lot of people who are against, this is a very important piece of information, because with the situation in Syria today, there's a lot of discussion: is Syria capitalist? Some people even claim Syria is fascist. Some people say it's capitalist. Some people say it's a mix. I would say Syria now is definitely a mixed economy. I mean, now the economy is unfortunately very largely destroyed, but the 1990s and 2000s leading up to 2011, I say it's very much a mixed economy. But I mean, if you look at the situation in Syria, I mean, the class dynamics were quite complex. The class dynamics of Syria are not the same as of Europe or even other Arab countries. It was much more complicated than even other Arab countries, so it was quite a complicated situation.
And the Baathist definition of socialism is that socialism is where the state is run by the working class. This is likely why Syria would not necessarily be considered socialist, while, as I'll get into, Iraq would be considered socialist. In the original constitution of the Ba'ath Party, which, despite any factional differences which would come about, anyone who calls himself a Baathist would need to be adhering to, the first constitution of the Ba'ath Party, written in 1947, called for the abolition of social classes.
But this is a very important piece of information to understand in understanding Syria today, because at this time period when Hafez al-Assad came in, he did bring a lot of investment into the country, and he modernized the country, and the living standards of the Syrians was actually increasing quite dramatically, and school was virtually free, healthcare provided by the state, and the way that the capitalist institutions, the private institutions functioned, was that they were guided by the state. They weren't just able to do whatever they want and screw over the average people. The Ba'ath Party in Syria definitely heavily regulated the private entities. The way that this regulation functioned, it was largely through the Syrian trade unions, which are very active in Syria and still exist despite the civil war. The trade unions, these were what you'd call political unions, and they would go to the government, and if there was some sort of grievance, they would sort of be the people who would watch the situation. If there's an abuse, the government would step in, and I mean, you could argue maybe this didn't go all the time, because there were honestly competing factions, and there likely were capitalists who had negative intentions. And as we eventually saw in the Syrian civil war, there was a significant amount of people who, did have negative intentions. And that's not to say, that there was, I'm certain that there was, negative aspects of, that occurred within the economy. But nonetheless, the way the mechanism worked was generally through the trade unions of Syria. And the state has would have the final say in the matter, but people have the right to strike. People have the right to those other basic union rights in Syria. Yeah. But also, an important thing is that the government did also talk about not only union rights, but union obligations, where that the unions, yes, at certain points, you have to, if there's a capitalist institution that they're working for, they do have the right to strike, but at the same time, they also have to be on the side of the government that's fighting for them. So there was, it sort of went two ways in that way.
Well, one thing I think is interesting, and you touched earlier about how the Ba'ath, emphasized the need for democracy and multi-parties. And it's interesting because, the Ba'ath leaders, Assad and Saddam Hussein are often called dictators. Whereas, we're not going to pretend they had the same level of human rights that exists in the West. But compared to, like, Saudi Arabia, where there were not multiple parties, there's one guy who rules for his whole life, but we never hear about Saudi Arabia as a dictatorship. Meanwhile, in Iraq and Syria, where they had multiple parties, they had elections, there may have been problems, but comparatively, these countries that are called dictators by the West are far more democratic by any standard measure than the countries that are aligned with the United States that are just absolute monarchies with, constitutions like something from the 1400s.
Yeah.
And it just shows like real irony in how we think about things, because no one ever thinks of all these U.S. aligned regimes like Oman or, you can go down the line, Kuwait. No one ever thinks of them as dictatorships. We don't even know the names of their monarchs. They're not considered to be dictatorships. Meanwhile, the Ba'ath countries, where they have multiple parties and all of that, are called dictatorships. It's just,
Yeah.
And that's not to say everything was perfect in the
Right,
Ba'ath countries,
of course, yeah.
But it's like,
Yeah.
it's like, what's more democratic?
Yeah, it's amazing because you can look at, and I'm going to get into Iraq, and actually a lot more depth, because I would argue that Iraq was much more socialist-oriented than Syria was. Syria had a difficult situation, so arguably they had to do it in a more of a mixed way. In Syria and Iraq, you could say that, these were, tools of the dictatorship, they could claim, but nonetheless, parliaments, people's committees, these things existed in Syria. These institutions existed, unlike in Saudi Arabia and the monarchy in Kuwait, where George Bush Sr. went in to rescue from evil Saddam Hussein, putting a republic in Kuwait, Saddam wanted to put a republic in Kuwait and stop them from siphoning off the oil. George Bush, went in and rescued the monarch, put him back on his throne. But yeah, they could argue that, these institutions are a sham, like they say about Venezuela, the pro-imperialists, they say that these institutions are just for show, but at least, at the very least they exist. There's a modern republican form of government with some democratic rights in these countries, as opposed to these monarchies where they just chop people's heads off if you criticize the government.
They don't even pretend in the countries aligned with the USA. It's just irony.
Yeah.
Another question.
Oh, can I maybe her? Cause yeah.
The pan-Arabism, where did that come from? The concept.
Yeah. Going back to the foundation of the party in 1947, the Ba'ath Party was founded in 1947, and pan-Arabism was the key aspect of the Ba'ath Party, founded in 1947. But pan-Arabism goes back, it's beyond the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party didn't create pan-Arabism. Pan-Arabism was really a popular feeling within the Arab world in many countries, and very visible in Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Libya, Algeria, in varying forms. They're very strong expressions and feelings of pan-Arabism, and it was really a reaction to the French and British division of the Arab world, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the French and British just simply drew lines on the map. They said, okay, you monarch. They move a monarch from over to here. Like in the case of Iraq, they took someone. In the case of the Jordan, they took, people to govern this area. Later they established the Saudi regime. So it was really a response to the colonialist borders established by the French and the British, because previously the Arab world didn't have that sort of division. When it was the Islamic civilizations, there were different caliphates and states, so to speak, but largely they weren't fractured up into these tiny entities that could easily be controlled. I didn't want to get too much into it because it's very complex, and but Saleh Jadid, who I was the first Baathist government I mentioned in Syria, he had actually overthrown a previous Baathist, and that Baathist, I believe he was a military leader, but he wasn't in very long. He didn't implement. There wasn't that much significant about his what he implemented. I suppose he was the first Baathist, and he had come in overthrowing a sort of a reactionary type of it was a republic, it wasn't a monarchy, but there was sort of a reactionary government that had come to power in Syria immediately following the breakup of the United Arab Republic. And so it's kind of complicated. So there were a number, before Hafez al-Assad came in, there were a couple of previous Baathist governments in Syria. So now switching back to Iraq, as I mentioned, the Ba'ath Party, in sort of going back in time, because I was just talking about 1970 Syria, now we're going back to 1968 Iraq. This is before Hafez al-Assad came to power in Syria. As I mentioned, there was the previous revolution with the Nasserists and Baathists in 1963. The Baathists were briefly in a coalition government with the Nasserists, but the Nasserists sidelined them and kicked them out of the government. 1968, the Ba'ath Party comes back, and this is a very important date in the history of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party in Iraq, because from 1968 up until 2003, the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party is in power. So this is the 1968 forward is the time period of really the Ba'ath Party implementing its vision in Iraq. So the reasons for this seizure of power by the Ba'ath Party in Iraq was because, as I mentioned, the Arif government had sidelined the Baathists, kicked them out of the government, and basically they all had to go underground. They were persecuted by the government, the Arif government. The Arif regime, it was an ostensibly Nasserist government, but from the perspective of the Baathists and the Communist Party, the Arif regime, which is actually, there are two Arif brothers. It's called the Arif regime because there were two Arifs. One of them died early on in a helicopter accident, so his brother took over, and they're both Nasserists. But from the perspective of the Baathists and the Communists, actually, the Arif regime was even more opportunistic than the Qasim military regime in Iraq previously. The Arif regime had started to improve relations with the United States, with Britain, and the powers that the Arab nationalists and socialists felt were the imperialists. They felt that that was a wrong decision to make.
These same powers were profiting off of Iraq's oil unfairly, because at this point, before the Baathists came to power, Iraq's oil is in the hands of private corporations, the West, especially England and the United States and other countries in Western Europe, and that these powers were major supporters of Zionism, which the Baathists viewed as the central question for the liberation of the Arab world, removing the occupation of Palestine.
And they felt that also the Arif regime was not implementing socialism in Iraq, so they felt it was necessary to remove the Arif regime from power as a bureaucratic reactionary regime. And 1968 in July, Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr and other Baathists within the Iraqi military overthrow the Arif regime. It's a very brief revolution. It's often described as the bloodless revolution because compared to the 1963 revolution, which was extremely bloody, a lot of death and killing, it was very quick and brief.
And at this time, despite the previous hostilities between the Baathists in Iraq and the Iraqi Communist Party, both parties begin to realize that the main beneficiaries of the rivalry between Baathists and Communists were the reactionary and right-wing forces, such as the Arab government and the interests that they represented. And Communist Party of Iraq was very supportive of the Baathist Revolution of 1968, particularly on the grounds that the overthrow of the Arab regime would be necessary because the Arab regime was opposed to a multi-party system, which the Ba'ath Party was had the opposite position on. The Ba'ath Party was in favor of a multi-party government, and when the Ba'ath Party came into power, the Communist Party became legal once again, and that the Communist Party actually got positions in the government and was in a coalition with the Ba'ath Party through what was called the National Progressive Front.
And so Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr becomes the president of Iraq, and Saddam Hussein starts to come into the picture. He's not the president. Bakr is the president, but he's Bakr's deputy, and he plays an important role in the government. And almost immediately, the Ba'ath Party, the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party of Iraq, with Bakr and Saddam leading it, really take Iraq in a new direction of massive development, socialism, and a very anti-imperialist, socialist-aligned foreign policy. An important thing to point out is that the oil of Iraq before the Baathists came to power in 1968 was largely not nationalized. I think it was about less than 20% of Iraq's oil was actually nationalized at that point, and that was a major criticism that the Baathists had of the Arab regime, was that they were not taking control of the country's resources and really developing the country. So the Baathists, in the early 1970s, I believe 1972, nationalized essentially all of the oil. After negotiations with they tried to negotiate with the various imperialist powers that have control of the private oil industry in Iraq, and they don't want to give up any of their control over Iraqi oil. So the Ba'ath Party actually goes to the Soviet Union for help to nationalize the country's oil, and they also sign a very important. Now, this is very important. When people say, again, I've already dismissed the myth of the Iraqi Baathists being CIA-backed or US-backed. Another very important myth, another very important thing that disproves that is the fact that they signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union. A very significant moment in allying Iraq with the Soviet Union, because this really protected Iraq from any imperialist intervention, or at the time the Shah of Iran was in power and was causing a lot of problems for the Arab world, for Iraq, funding separatists and various militia groups to try and destabilize Iraq.
One of the very important reasons why it was so necessary for the Ba'ath Party to effectively and swiftly nationalize the oil was because shortly after the Ba'ath Party came to power, there were a number of attempts to overthrow the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, and these attempted overthrows were supported by the Iraq Petroleum Corporation, which was controlled by foreign oil companies. And actually, Saddam Hussein, who was vice president, was one of the main leaders in implementation of the nationalization of the Iraq Petroleum Company. An excellent book on Baathist Iraq and the development of the Iraqi economy under the Ba'ath Party in the 1970s is called Socialist Iraq, a study in Iraqi politics since 1968 by Majid Khadouri. And I'm going to read an excerpt from it on the subject of nationalization of oil. Saddam Hussein, Vice President of the Revolutionary Command Council, RCC, seems to have taken the lead in implementation of nationalization of the IPC, the Iraq Petroleum Corporation. In a conversation with the writer, Saddam said that the matter was of great importance to him and he was responsible for several preliminary steps taken to ensure success of the action, as he was concerned about possible foreign retaliations. Despite preparedness to cut expenditures and postpone some development projects, he was afraid that the Iraqi government might not be able to meet its basic financial needs if the major oil companies should boycott Iraqi oil. The Soviet Union was consulted on the matter, but, though tacitly agreed on nationalization in principle, seems to have given Iraq no encouragement in the drive to nationalize Western oil operations. Saddam said he instructed the Ministry of Finance to arrange the transfer of Iraqi assets, small as they may have been, from British to Swiss banks long before the first step was taken in order to avoid the possibility of freezing these assets by the British government in retaliation. Moreover, the Iraqi government sounded out some of the Arab oil companies about the possibility of borrowing funds in case of need before it could market its crude oil. Shortly after nationalization, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Libya offered short-term loans with which Iraq utilized before the nationalized industry began to operate and yield income. After trying to negotiate with the private companies which had control over Iraqi oil, the government of Iraq fully nationalized the Iraq Petroleum Corporation, which previously controlled Iraq's oil industry and was a private corporation which was really run by the foreign oil companies. That was nationalized, and the Iraqi National Oil Company was formed, and the first agreement signed with a foreign country by the Iraqi National Oil Company was with the Soviet Machino Export Organization, which stipulated that the Soviet Union would provide equipment and technical assistance with which Iraq would start its own national oil industry. So Iraq's national state-controlled oil industry, created under the Ba'ath Party, was started with the heavy support of the Soviet Union. The Iraqi National Oil Company also made some agreements with Socialist Hungary, with the Hungarian chemical complex establishment, which provided the Iraqi oil industry with technical assistance and credit.
So the Ba'ath Party, under leadership in Iraq, under the leadership of Bakr and Saddam, nationalized Iraq's oil, and with Soviet help, they open up. You've probably heard of the Rumaila oil fields in Iraq. It's a very important oil field for Iraq's national production. The Soviet technicians actually helped and helped build that facility in Rumaila in 1972, and or leading up to 72. It was finally opened in 1972, and you can find some very nice photographs of the opening of the Rumaila oil fields with Saddam Hussein and Kosygin from the Soviet Union, and there's Soviet and Iraqi flags flying on the oil facilities for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, and that's a very key moment for Iraq, because now Iraq has control of its resources. It has a strong ally that can help them develop their economy, and along with this international reorientation, they obviously this treaty of friendship treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union. This is obviously a major aspect in putting Iraq in the anti-imperialist socialist camp. And there's a very good quote from Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr related to East Germany. Iraq was the first technically non-Marxist Leninist state to recognize East Germany. There's a quote from Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr on the occasion. Aside from the fact that we are two socialist republics and have common aims, we recall with pride and joy the attitude taken by the GDR, East Germany, in condemning aggression and supporting the Arab cause, and we remember the fact that the GDR does not maintain any relations with the aggressor and that it combats imperialism and colonialism. Again, we have to thank the GDR in this attitude. Another very good quote from outside Iraq related to Iraq's reorientation during Saddam Hussein and Bakr in the 1970s is from Kim Il-sung, actually. When in the 1970s, I forget the year, sometime in the 1970s, Iraqi journalists went to Pyongyang, North Korea to interview Kim Il-sung. And the answer to one of the questions posed by the Iraqi journalist, Kim Il-sung said, "The Korean people value the experience accumulated by the Iraqi people and the struggle against imperialism and the Israeli aggressors and for unity, freedom, and socialism under the leadership of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party." That's Kim Il-sung. And obviously he references very clearly the slogan of the Ba'ath Party, unity, freedom, socialism. So as you can see, also Iraq forges very close relations with Cuba, revolutionary Cuba. Saddam Hussein visits Havana and actually gets free back surgery provided by Fidel Castro. And there's a lot of good pictures of Fidel Castro and Saddam Hussein sitting in a car driving around parts of Cuba, and they become very close personal friends and allies, which actually is very important in the 1990s when Cuba actually gave a significant amount of medical aid to Iraq to try and alleviate some of the brutal sanctions against Iraq. So it's very clear Iraq is oriented under the Ba'ath Party, Saddam and Bakr. It takes the most revolutionary international position that's ever taken previously. There's never been a more anti-imperialist orientation in the country. So there's also the aspect of, the most important aspect, I would say, of Baathist Iraq is the economy. And I talked about the complications in Syria with the class dynamics, and the complicated situation implementing socialism and the prior stage state capitalism in Syria. But in Iraq, you could sort of say they kind of went the full way in socialist development. In 1968, before the Ba'ath Party came to power, that was the year of the revolution, 24.5% of the economy was state-run. So the vast majority of it, about three quarters, is private. By 1979, 1980, it's completely changed to 82% public state-run enterprise and only 18% private enterprise. Now, here comes the point where people say, oh, government doing stuff, that's not necessarily socialism, even though that's a pretty big chunk, more than Venezuela today, which is about 33%. Most of these same people would say Venezuela is socialist, even though it's got a very small percentage of the economy under public and state run. Iraq had 82% state run by 1980. But further, going into the Ba'ath Party and their view on socialism, what socialism is and what socialism isn't, to get a very good view of that, you should go to the words of the Baathists, what they actually say about socialism. This is a report from the political report from the 8th Congress of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, commemorating the anniversary of the 1968 revolution. This is from the 8th Congress, which was held in 1974. And at that Congress, they talk in depth about the need to develop an anti-imperialist line, to promote pan-Arabism, to develop the country, strengthen the economy, settling of the issue of the questions of national minorities in the country, and of course the question of socialism. You know, the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party, what is socialism? Now, the political report, the 8th Congress of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party in Iraq, section on the aspect of socialism, there's a very strong statement which gives you a clear view that the socialism of Bakr and Saddam is, in fact, scientific socialism in the full sense of the word. Quote, "State capitalism is a distorted form of socialism. It negates or falsifies the democratic modes of production, suppresses the true role of the working class, and stifles its vitality. It puts control of production into the hands of bureaucrats who impose on workers and junior officials a new form of dictatorship, not very different in methods and results from bourgeois dictatorship. For directly or indirectly, their exploitation comes to resemble bourgeois exploitation. Moreover, state capitalism falsely considers socialism confined solely to economic management of state and society." Another very important quote related to the view of Saddam and Bakr's wing of the Ba'ath Party, as it relates to what socialism is and what socialism isn't, also from the 8th Congress of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party held in Iraq in 1974, quote, same document, "Centralism with democratic content and state capitalism are in total contradiction. The working class, their organizations, and some administrators may not have reached an adequate cultural, technical, and organizational standard to participate in the management of production, but this does not justify the dictatorial practices of state capitalism. It is the party's responsibility to raise the standards and political understanding of the working class and government officials, for it embodies their interests and those of the toiling masses in Arab society." Now, I think these quotes really demonstrate quite clearly that the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, led by Bakr and Saddam in the 1970s, had a very deep and clear view of what socialism is, and that state capitalism is not the same thing as socialism.
Now, even to ultra-leftists who like to attack anti-imperialist governments all the time and always the ones who say that's not real socialism, even to their definitions of socialism, I mean, from these quotes, you can see that the political report of the 8th Congress of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party is actually calling for literally not just state control of the economy, but workers' control of the means of production. With this part of the quote in particular, quote, "The working class, their organizations, and some administrators may not have reached an adequate technical and organizational standard to participate in the management of production, but this does not justify the dictatorial practices of state capitalism." So it's saying that the goal is to have the workers managing production, which, I mean, to even the most ultra-leftist definitions of socialism, Iraq certainly had a very revolutionary socialist government. And the Communist Party of Iraq was certainly very supportive of this position of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party.
I didn't mention it previously, but this is a very important aspect of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. Michel Aflaq, one of the key founders of the Ba'ath Party, who is a Syrian, he's from Syria, and one of the key founders of the party, he actually fled Syria because when I said the Bakr Saddam faction, it's really the Aflaq faction, and Bakr and Saddam were the government people in Iraq. So at this point, Michel Aflaq is actually the leader of the Ba'ath Party headed in Iraq. So it's the Aflaq-Bakr-Saddam government at this point, really. They're implementing Michel Aflaq's view on socialism. And I haven't given any statements from Michel Aflaq, and I think it'd be very good to do so, to show you his view on what socialism is. Okay, this is from Michel Aflaq, quote, "We are part of the working class. True socialists consider themselves part of the working class. The socialist rule is that which is led by the working class." Another good quote from Michel Aflaq on what socialism is. "He who thinks that socialism is a religion of pity is gravely mistaken. We are not hermits taking refuge in mercy to give peace to a conscience disturbed by seeing misery and suffering so that we become great in our own eyes and sleep untroubled. Defending deprived masses is not a matter of giving alms, but demanding their rights. We are not only concerned about alleviating misery, but also about increasing the wealth of life." I think that's a very important view, because we have a very scientific and developed vision of what socialism is that, you know, many communists and Marxist-Leninists should basically agree with, the idea of the rule of the working class and getting rid of bureaucracy and implementing, you know, socialism at a grassroots level. But there's also very important in that last statement, he talks about the necessity to raise the wealth of the people, to increase the living standards of the people. And this is a very important,
It's worth reading again.
Sure.
Who's this again? This is great.
This is Michel Aflaq, who is
Aflaq, the founder of the Ba'ath Party in Syria.
Yeah, and he became the head of the Iraq wing of the Ba'ath Party, and he became very opposed to Assad, but there's that conflict between Syria and Iraq. But the final part is, we're not only concerned about alleviating misery, but also about increasing the wealth of life. Now, this is something that a lot of socialists and communists, I'm afraid, have actually sort of lost sight of. There's a lot of talk about you know, seizing the means of production. There's like a meme about that, seize the means of production. There's truth to that, but the goal of socialism is not to build a society off the remains of the previous society. It's about to build new wealth and unleashing the power of the country to increase the living standards of the people, where the economy is governed by rational thought, not by profits. And the goal of socialism is not to have equality and poverty, but to have wealth for the society at large and not have a small elite controlling the economy. And this is exactly what the Baathists in Iraq did. They massively, in the 1970s, this is the really strong era of socialism in Iraq, the 1970s. They really did raise the living standards of the people. The number of people benefiting from pure drinking water tripled from 1968 to 1979. 1968, the Ba'ath Party came to power. Before that, they weren't in power. So in that, from 68 to 79, the number of people benefiting from pure drinking water more than tripled. The question of the agriculture, I've talked about the economy and the working class, but the question of agriculture is also very important to the Baathists. They established collective farms, cooperative farms, state farms, and I have some very good statistics, specific statistics on the cooperative farms that existed in Iraq. 1968, there were approximately 5,000, this is before the Baathists came in, 1968, there were approximately 5,000 cooperative farmers. By 1979, with the changes that Bakr and Saddam had implemented in Iraq, that number had gone up to approximately 36,000. So it's a massive increase, like compared to, it was practically nothing beforehand.
And one of the major reasons for that was because the agrarian reform carried out by the Qasim regime did not include a huge amount of lands, and it was very minor, very limited compared to the agrarian reform carried out by the Baathists after 1968. The Qasim government, on paper, talked about some form of agricultural reform, but there was not, prior to the Baathists coming to power, the peasantry did not have control over the land. And at this point is when the Ba'ath Party begins to redistribute the land to the peasantry and implement collective farms, state farms, and cooperative farms. The Baathist agrarian reform took over a lot more land and was much more radical and didn't provide compensation to the landlords. And the fact that the Baathist agrarian reform took over so much more land, they were able to provide a lot more of it for the peasantry to control directly through the collective farms and cooperative farms. Now, on the cooperative farms, land belongs to the cooperative, and the peasants who participate in cultivation receive remuneration, each in accordance with the amount of work contributed. In collective farms, ownership is collective, and farms share the product roughly on the basis of their active participation in cultivation. In both these types, farmers are given crops and machinery by cooperative societies in lieu of certain percentage of product, amounting to roughly 10%. The products are normally sold through cooperatives to government agencies, which in turn distribute and sell to private shops. In state farms, the state owns the land and controls production and marketing. The peasants are employed as wage earners to the state, and in all three categories, the government supervises the operation and all activities in order to ensure that the peasants will be treated equitably and derive the utmost benefit from their work. In the 1970s, there were 2 5-year plans implemented by the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party. There had previously been an issue in developing industry in Iraq because as the increase in industrialization would take place, there would often be a decrease in the level of agricultural production, and for there to be industrialization, there needs to be a strong basis of agricultural production. So the 5-year plans implemented in Iraq were aimed at, on one hand, industrializing the country and making Iraq economically independent, and on the other hand, strengthening agriculture and having agriculture done in a way that is very beneficial to the peasantry. That way they don't leave the countryside and go into the cities seeking jobs in industry, because agriculture would be beneficial enough so that they wouldn't feel the need to leave.
As I mentioned also, with the full nationalization of oil, those resources were able to be put into the wealth of the country, into Iraq. The implemented a universal healthcare system, universal education, housing, and all of those socialist progressive policies. And as far as the education, going specifically into that, it was really remarkable what Bakr and Saddam achieved in the 1970s. The number of children in kindergartens increased 7 times. From 1968 to 1979, 1980, it increased 7-fold due to the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. The number of students in primary and secondary school nearly tripled from 1968 to 1979, 1980. The number of students enrolled in universities more than doubled from 1968 to 1979, 1980. The number of technical school graduates increased by 16 times from 1968 to 1979. So there was a massive modernization and socialism implementation in Iraq. And
another very important topic is the issue of national minorities in Iraq who were not Arab, such as the Kurds. Now, Saddam Hussein is attacked a lot for oppressing the Kurds, but when we look at the facts objectively, we see that the situation is quite different from what the so-called humanitarian, interventionist, imperialist official history claims. Once the Ba'ath Party came to power in Iraq in 1968, they were determined to find a solution to the issues facing the Kurdish population. There was a war going on in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq long before the Baathists came to power, so it was a high priority to be resolved. The Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party entered into negotiations with the Kurdish political parties who were fighting for Kurdish rights, and in 1970, the manifesto on the peaceful settlement of the Kurdish issue in Iraq was signed onto by the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party and the Kurdish patriotic parties. This was achieved on the basis of dialogue and peaceful cooperation. The laws of Baathist Iraq recognized the Kurdish nationality as an official nationality in the Republic of Iraq and recognized the Kurdish language as one of the official languages in Iraq along with Arabic. The Kurdish language by law was to be taught in schools in the areas of northern Iraq where Kurds lived. The Baathist government, led by Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr and Saddam Hussein, established the university in Suleimania, run primarily by Kurds. The Kurdish patriotic political parties entered into the Iraqi government through the National Progressive Front alongside the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party and the Communist Party of Iraq. The government of Iraq granted amnesty to all Kurds who had previously engaged in violent activities in the north. Kurdish national holidays became official holidays in Iraq, and the Iraqi government promoted Kurdish literature and art in the country. Now this would all probably come as a shock to most people, but it's the truth of the situation.
During this time in the 1970s, as I mentioned, it was Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, the Iraq wing of the Ba'ath Party, was president. And Saddam Hussein, he was a deputy of Bakr for a while. Then he became vice president. But Saddam Hussein actually became president in 1979. And 1979 was a very important year in the situation with Iraq because Saddam Hussein becomes president, but there isn't... Saddam Hussein and Bakr are basically of the same mind. They're not... Saddam doesn't have a different... They're of the same beliefs, basically. And a lot of times, there's this mythology that Saddam pushed Bakr out of office, but there's no evidence of that. All the evidence suggests that Bakr, he was getting old towards the end of his career, and he wanted to give the presidency to a newer face, someone like Saddam Hussein, who had been working very hard to develop the country, going abroad, visiting other socialist countries, visiting even some Western countries like France. France was probably the closest of the Western countries in relations to Iraq. And France actually helped develop some of Iraq's nuclear facilities. Famously, during the Iran-Iraq War, the Israelis, very well known, I think it's Operation Opera, the Israelis also attacked the nuclear facility and destroyed it. And actually, they killed some French scientists, I believe, who were operating there. And the French government, I don't think, ever held the Israelis accountable. Not too surprising. But so 1979, Saddam Hussein, he becomes the new president of Iraq. Bakr basically goes into retirement. It's a very important year in 1979, also because Iran has a revolution which overthrows the corrupt imperialist monarch, the Shah. And the Shah of Iran was a major enemy of Iraq and the Arab world. The Shah was a close ally of Israel and basically a stooge of the United States. He was squandering the wealth of Iran and really holding back the national development of the Iranian civilization. So Iraq was actually very happy with the overthrow of the Shah and was very praised, gave tremendous praise to the Iranian Revolution. Actually, I have a good quote from a Ba'ath Party in Iraq, Ba'ath Party newspaper, that sort of gives you a view of how the Iraqis, before the revolution, during the time of the Shah, saw the Shah as a major enemy, and the Shah was intervening, funding separatists, Kurdish separatists in the north to destabilize the country. And they had also stolen 3 Arab territories, not Iraq, in the Gulf, I believe. They just came in and occupied some Arab territories. So Iran was seen as a menace. Zionist and imperialist-backed Iran was seen as a menace to the Arab world during the Shah. And from the Thawra daily newspaper, Thawra, that means revolution in Arabic, the Thawra daily paper of the Arab Ba'ath Socialist Party in Iraq, 1974. The Iranian government cannot dare launch a military aggression against Iraq during the rage of battle. This is due to vital considerations, namely the emotions of the Muslim Iranians. Now that's an interesting. This is before Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution. They mention this. The emotions of the Muslim Iranians who support the just Arab cause. The Iranian government's desire not to insulate itself from Arab states. The Shah wanted to have good relations with the reactionary Arab states like Saudi Arabia and others in the Gulf. And the presence at the Iranian border of the Soviet Union, which is bound with Iraq by a treaty of friendship and cooperation. So Iran is, during the time of the Shah, is a major enemy for Iraq, a major threat for Iraq, and Iraq, led by Bakr and Saddam, see the Soviet Union as a great force that can keep the Shah in check, keep Iran from its expansionist ambitions, because also the Soviet Union has a significant border with Iran in the Caucasus and also Central Asia. So if the Shah was to act against Iraq, which had a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union, they would likely be in trouble with the Soviet Union. So the Baathists were against the Shah. They praised the overthrow of the Shah. And the Iranian Revolution, it's an interesting situation because it was a revolution led by socialists, nationalists, communists, fundamentalists. And the interesting thing is that eventually Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power in Iran. And he is a Shia fundamentalist who had actually been given refuge in Iraq by the Baathists previously, interestingly enough. Khomeini had been basically in exile from Iran because the Shah wanted to kill him. And the Baathists actually gave Khomeini refuge, which is kind of ironic because later Khomeini wants to overthrow the Baathists in Iraq. The Iraqi Baathists, they come to a negotiation with the Shah of Iran to stop the Shah from intervening in Arab affairs and Iraqi affairs to try and limit the Shah's aggressive activities against Iraq. So a concession they have to make, amongst other things, is that Khomeini has to leave. Saddam and Bakr, they don't turn over Khomeini to the Shah. They tell him he's free to leave the country. They're not going to turn you over to the Shah, but this is a concession. So he goes over to France and he's, preaching and giving his message from France. So he comes back to Iran, and it's very interesting because Khomeini, was given support by Iraq previously by the Baathists, and the Baathists were very sympathetic to the Iranian Revolution. And there's a quote from Saddam Hussein where he says that he's asked about the Iranian Revolution, I think in 1979 or leading up to 1979. A journalist asks him his view on the Iranian Revolution, and of course Iran is not an Arabic country; it's outside of the Arab world. So the journalist asks him from the perspective of a Baathist, an Arab nationalist, what do you think of the Iranian Revolution? And Saddam basically says that we see in the spirit of the youth fighting against tyranny, whether they're Baathist or non-Baathist, whether they're Arab or non-Arab, the spirit of the Ba'ath Party. So he was Saddam Hussein even personally was very sympathetic to the Iranian Revolution. The Khomeini and the other rulers of Iran begin to make declarations against the Iraqi government, referring to it as a infidel Baathist government, and that the Shia population of Iraq should revolt against the Iraqi government. Now it's important to get into the demographics because Iraq is technically now a majority a Shia country, but at that time there was a lot of intermarriage between Sunnis and Shias, and most of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq was actually Shia. And this call by Khomeini for the Shias, first even to refer to the Iraqis as Shias is a very negative thing, because it's sort of one of the first cracks in the sectarianism that we see in Iraq today. This attempt to try and say, okay, you people are Shia, you should follow what I'm saying as a Shia fundamentalist, and overthrow this socialist, secular socialist government. Khomeini funds underground Shia extremist fundamentalist terrorist groups, such as the Dawa Party, which carries out bombings in Iraq. And mind you, this is before the Iran-Iraq war is declared. Iraq had not, declared war on Iran. This is leading up to the Iraq-Iran war. Iran's funding these extremist jihadist forces who are fighting in the name of Shia Islam against a infidel Baathist regime, as they call it. And they try to divide the Iraqi society on a sectarian religious basis. And they carry out an assassination attempt. It fails against Iraqi government member of the Ba'ath Party, Tariq Aziz, who's, well, I think he's kind of well known by some Americans who lived through the Gulf War, because he spoke English and he was giving the Iraqi perspective about why the United States should remove sanctions from Iraq and so on. And he's actually an Iraqi Christian, which is interesting. Part of another reason why Americans may take some interest in Tariq Aziz, because there's a lot of times there's concern over the Christian communities in the Middle East, the Arab world, and as we could see, some top government officials during Saddam Hussein were Christians. Similar in Syria with Assad, the Christians are in the government and have a very good, very good situation in society. I mean, Christmas is even celebrated. Just a few weeks ago in Syria, Christmas was celebrated in Damascus. It was likewise in Iraq. There's Christmas celebrations. Churches are operating. Christianity, Christians live very well in the society and participate in the political life of the society. Khomeiniist forces attempt to assassinate Tariq Aziz. It fails, but they carry out a lot of bombings throughout the country, like leaving timed bombs in different public places, and it causes chaos in the country. It's kind of interesting because today we see what's going on in Syria, and it's very similar to what Khomeini tried to do in Iraq, but it's sort of a mirror image, because in Iraq, backed by Khomeini, it was in the name supposedly of Shia Islam against an infidel Baathist government, as they would claim. In Syria today, it is Wahhabi, Salafist jihadists trying to overthrow, in the name supposedly of Sunni Islam, an infidel Baathist government. So it's sort of like the mirror image. The attempt by the Khomeinists to overthrow Saddam Hussein was basically a mirror image of what we see in Syria today. It's an attempt to divide the country and pit one group of the society, religious group of the society, against another, and get rid of all of the progressive reforms, socialism in the economy, the ideas of pan-Arabism, anti-Zionism, anti-imperialism, the status of women's rights in society, because in Iraq and Syria, women were very active in the government, in the Ba'ath Party in both countries, and as well as an attempt to basically institute a very reactionary fundamentalist regime. What they do with Assad now is they say that he is oppressing the Sunnis, which is false, because most of the we have a
that's not true. A lie.
Exactly. It's a total lie to destabilize the country. Just as they lie about Assad oppressing the Sunnis, it's a total lie. Most of the army is Sunni. Most of the Ba'ath Party was actually Sunni, from what I understand. Likewise, in Iraq, the Shias were not being oppressed by Saddam. Most of the party was Shia, actually. The foreign minister at the time of the Iran-Iraq war, Sadoun Hamadi, he's from Shia background, and he said, you could find it on YouTube, he talks about how we need to fight against Khomeiniism and the Iranian threat. And he's an Arab, Iraqi Shia and a Baathist. And this attempt by the Khomeinists to try and divide and conquer the Iraqi society was a complete failure at that time. So So the situation's heating up. The Iranians, they're making statements against the Iraqi government. They're funding these sectarian terrorist groups to try and destabilize the government and overthrow the government. It gets even worse, though. The Iranians, they begin to fire artillery over the border with Iraq, shelling border positions. 1979 and 1980, there are dozens of military aircraft violations of the border by Iranian aircraft violating the border, passing into Iraqi territory. There's over a dozen border post shellings from artillery, Iranian artillery shelling Iraqi border posts. And there's about a dozen between 1979, all in 1979 actually, following the Iranian Revolution. There's about a dozen incidents where Iraqi ships in the Persian Gulf or Arab Gulf, depending on your perspective, are passing through, because that's where Iraq transports a lot of its oil from. There's approximately a dozen incidents where Iraqi ships are boarded, searched, and harassed by the Iranian Navy. So, under international law, the Iraqi government would be well in its right to, retaliate against the Iranians at this point. But the amazing thing is that Saddam Hussein doesn't. Not at this point. Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi government try everything they can before declaring war on the Iranians, because they understand that a war with Iran would be very devastating to both countries, and that, we all saw what happened with the Iran-Iraq war. So the Iraqi government goes to the non-aligned movement, which Iraq is part of, and I believe Iran, following the revolution, signed on to the non-aligned movement. So Iraq and Iran were both part of the non-aligned movement. So they go to the non-aligned movement, and they go to Cuba specifically, if I remember correctly, and they speak with the Cubans and try to have the Cubans as a negotiator with the Iranians. And the response of the Iranians is Saddam Hussein is a Baathist infidel. He is a secularist. We want Shia Islam in Iraq. We want the overthrow of the Iraqi government. So the Khomeini completely rejects the overtures by Iraq to, stop this one-sided aggression on the part of the Iranians. So they still don't declare war on the Iranians. The Iraqi government goes to the United Nations and tries to negotiate with Iran to, make some kind of agreement about the borders, because the argument of the Khomeinists is that, well, all these agreements were done by the Shah, so they're totally illegitimate. But the problem is, a new government comes to power in Iran. You can't just bomb across the border. You can't invade. You can't call for the overthrow of the neighboring country. You can't just assault the next country. You have to say, okay, we know you made this agreement with the previous government, but we don't think this is just. We want to renegotiate this. The Iraqis were being extremely conciliatory. They went to the non-aligned movement, the United Nations, and lo and behold, when they go to the United Nations to negotiate with Khomeini, not Khomeini per se, but his government, his officials give the same response. We are not going to negotiate with the Iraqi government. We want the complete overthrow of Saddam Hussein, the Baathist infidel regime in Iraq. So the situation is terrible between the two countries. But still, Iraq has not declared war on Iran. The final straw that causes Saddam Hussein to be forced to declare war, the waterway of Iraq, Shatt al-Arab, which was agreed upon between Iran and Iraq and has historically been considered Arab territory and Iraqi territory, the Iranians send their navy and blockade it. Now that's Iraq's only waterway to the Gulf and to get out into the waters. So at this point, the Iraqis, they've tried everything to negotiate with the Iranians. They refused. So on September 22nd, 1980, Saddam Hussein announces the termination of the agreements that the Republic of Iraq had made with the monarchy of Iran, with the Shah. And he states that being that the Iranians refused to hold up their end of the negotiations between Iraq and Iran, we have removed our obligations to uphold our side of the agreement. The Iraqi army sweeps into southern Iran, pushes the Iran. Iran is totally disorganized after the revolution. It's a much stronger country, actually, militarily. It's at this point, Khomeini's in power. It's fully stocked with American, British, and Western weaponry left over from the Shah, and Israeli weaponry left over from the Shah. So the Iraqi army sweeps in. They push the Iranians out of much of the southern territory of Iran, which is called Khuzestan, sometimes called Ahwaz, also sometimes called Arabistan, because that region of southern Iran is actually populated mostly by Arabic-speaking people. It's mostly Arabs in that area. And during the revolution against the Shah, there's actually a strong Arab nationalist sentiment and movement for liberation of the Arab territory of Ahwaz, Arabistan as they call it. And they had been fighting against the Shah because the Shah was basically a Persian supremacist type of government which oppressed the Arabs, the Kurds, the Baluchistanis, the various ethnic groups of Iran. And so there's a historical movement there. Some of the Baathist ideology says, well, this should be integrated into the Arab homeland, but all of the statements that Iraq is making doesn't include, if you look at it, it does not include any claim to this Arab but Iranian territory. All they want from day one, when the Iraqis push in and push the Iranians back inside of Iran, the Iraqis say, and you could see interviews with Sadoun Hamadi, who's the foreign minister of Iraq at the time, who was actually Shia himself. He says that, going back to where I left off, the Iraqis, they push the Iranians back. They tell them, okay, just recognize our international borders. The Iranians refuse, and there's a very bloody back and forth. For a number of years, the Iran-Iraq War lasts from 1980 to 1988. And the Iran-Iraq War actually becomes a very internationalized war. Many, many players, and very complicated, very contradictory, very embarrassing, as I'll tell you one very embarrassing aspect of it. When you look at the international players in it, they're very complex and very hard, very difficult situation for people to wrap their head around, because there is this idea like, oh yeah, the US, they supported Saddam to get back at the Iranians. Everybody knows that. Well, as far as the international support for both sides, Iraq's main supporter, as I pointed to all of the extensive relations they had with the Soviet Union, Iraq's army was almost entirely Soviet equipped at that time, an Eastern Bloc equipped. They did have a number of planes, the Mirage plane from France, because they had good relations with France, but the vast, vast majority of Iraqi weaponry, the tanks, aircraft, artillery, helicopters, rifles, almost all of their equipment is Soviet and Eastern Bloc weaponry, and some from China as well. Iran is largely equipped with Western and American and Israeli weaponry left over from the Shah. So that leaves that puts Iran in an interesting position. And as it relates to the United States, which is sort of the elephant in the room, the support, as I said, the United States did give support to both sides at strategic points. And for example, what they gave to the Iraqis at certain points when they wanted to slow down the Iranians, they gave Iraq satellite intelligence at certain points. And some people say, I'm not sure if it's confirmed, but some people point to chemical components. They had purchased some chemical components from the United States, which is obviously a lot of people pointed to hypocrisy of the United States, because later the United States talked about weapons of mass destruction when Iraq had actually bought some components of chemical weapons from the United States. It wasn't a problem then. All of a sudden, they're making an issue of it. They also bought chemical components from East and West Germany. They'd gotten some chemical support from the Soviet Union. Now on the Iranian side, it's also quite interesting because, as I said several times, the U.S. supported both sides. The most undeniable and known about aspect of U.S. support to Khomeini came in the Iran-Contra scandal, which I don't think anyone denies as Saddamist propaganda. I think the Iran-Contra scandal is pretty clear it happened, where the United States, Reagan, sold weapons to a country that they considered a foreign supplier of terrorism. The United States considered Iran a foreign supplier of terrorism, but Reagan sold a huge amount of weapons to Khomeini, which made the war last for long. So the U.S. backed both sides. Israel actually had given support to Iran and Khomeini as well, which is not very well known about, because this is the time period where Iran probably has like the most radical anti-imperialist government. Israel actually, according to Israeli government sources, according to the Israeli government sources and Israeli historians, there were actually Israeli military personnel in the outskirts of Tehran training Khomeini's military. And there was also weaponry, Israeli weaponry that went to the Iranians. Now the Iranians, their argument would be, well, we had all these weapons left over from the Shah. We needed the pieces to, replenish our military supply and pieces and so on. But nonetheless, Khomeini, on record, had dealings with Israel, which Iraq never did. Iraq never had any kind of relations with Israel on any level, secret or in the open. Another aspect that further complicates the situation is that the role of the Soviet Union and other anti-imperialist countries. There's a level of confusion on this point. When the war breaks out with Iran, initially the Soviet Union reduces arms supplies to Iraq because they feel that the war should be prevented. The Iraqis themselves didn't want the war to happen, but the Soviets, they feel that they want to do anything to try and stop the war from happening. Later on in the war, as the war is dragging on, the Soviets continue giving support to Iraq and Saddam Hussein. On the other side, it's interesting because we have Israel and the United States secretly supporting Khomeini, but we also have a number of anti-imperialist and anti-Zionist governments supporting Khomeini against Iraq, including Gaddafi's Libya and Assad's Syria. As I mentioned, there's the break between or Bakr, Saddam, and Aflaq on the Iraqi wing of the party, and Assad's his faction of the party. So Assad in Syria supported Iran, as well Gaddafi also supported Iran, and also North Korea also supported Iran. And that's an unfortunate moment because at this point, actually, Iraq and North Korea actually broke off relations. The North Koreans had very close relations with Syria, and it's likely that they were given false information that this was an American, Saddam was a U.S. puppet, which is ironic because Kim Il-sung was previously praising the Ba'ath Party, and they knew Iraq was not a U.S. puppet. So the war drags on, and eventually the war ends in 1988, and there's not much change to the border. It's basically the border is preserved. The Iraqis declare victory. The Iranians declare victory. The Iranians declare victory because they claim that it was Iraq trying to invade and conquer Iran, and they say that this is the new Arab conquest. The Arabs are always trying to conquer Iran, so they're saying this is the new Arab invasion. The Iraqis say that Iraq won because it stopped Iran from bombing over the border and trying to assassinate its politicians and blocking the waterway. So as far as like a change to the situation, I mean, Iran was forced to recognize the sovereignty of Iraq, so that's why the Iraqis and Saddam would say that it was a victory. But it was a devastating war. Both countries lost a tremendous amount of people, and we sort of know what happened later after the Iran-Iraq War. There was the Gulf War, and then the terrible sanctions against Iraq, and then eventually the invasion of Iraq. So up until the Iran-Iraq War basically started in 1980. Up until 2003, Iraq was basically in a state of war or extreme sanctions where the country was not able, the economy was basically not able to function in a natural way. It was basically paralyzed by war and sanctions. So what I really wanted to cover when it comes to Iraq is the 1970s and really give you a sense of how Iraq really was a socialist country in the full sense of the word, in a real scientific sense of the word. They really did develop socialism, and they made it clear that they were not trying to implement any form of state capitalism, and they had a deep understanding of what socialism truly meant, as well as the contradictions in Syria, the complicated situation.
Both Baathist Syria and Baathist Iraq were nominally Baathist and socialist, but in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, they were deeply at odds with one another. Both countries took similar positions on international issues for the most part, on the basis of anti-imperialism, and were both aligned with the Soviet Union to such an extent that both countries had a massive number of Soviet troops inside Syria and Iraq up until the collapse of the USSR. There were even Soviet troops stationed in Iraq during the war with Iran, and during the Gulf War with the United States in 1990-1991, many observers would look at Iraq with Saddam Hussein and Syria with Hafez al-Assad and think, why were these countries enemies when they're both Baathist? So I hope this presentation cleared up any questions people have about the history of Baathism so that people can have a clearer understanding of what's going on in the Middle East today.